Hello. A couple of weeks ago, I asked over on my Patreon if anyone had any aiming questions they wanted to ask me, and I got a fair few that really forced me to kind of solidify and challenge my own ideas about various topics. And I wanted to share some of my favorite ones here because I found it really insightful to kind of be forced to think about some stuff that I usually wouldn't make a video about or maybe haven't written about yet. Writing always helps me solidify my ideas, and this was a really nice kind of broad place to do that in. So hope you'll find this useful. And I think my favorite question from the lot of them was, how does one tell if a certain aspect simply needs more training, or if your fundamental technique is flawed and needs readjusting? If so, how does one fix this and work on technique alone? And that one's from Cookie. And like I said, this is just a fantastic question, so thank you firstly. But before I answer it properly, I want to say that I think it's pretty rare for someone to be at a really high level of aim training and still be approaching scenarios in a fundamentally incorrect way. There are absolutely examples of newer players, for example, playing static completely wrong, maybe going for insta flicks. But once you get to master, maybe grandmaster, you'll almost be locked out of anything higher if you have a fundamentally incorrect technique. So you'll kind of be forced to naturally develop properly correct technique if you want to kind of climb past that level, or at least something adjacent to fundamentally correct, And right now, I'll get into this with another question. There aren't really uniform ideas of what good technique is, especially for static. There are a lot of conflicting ideas and theories, and they can clearly all work. So I don't think there's one way to approach each scenario. And I kind of want to make that clear early as well. But I think what is more common, and this is an important distinction I promise, is for someone to need to alter their technique slightly to improve further. So if you get to master, grandmaster, you might hit that wall and you might have to change something about your technique to actually push your score. And I think it is more helpful than thinking of it as a complete restructure of your aim, since you're not developing entirely new skills. You're refining what you've already learned. And reframing it this way made the idea that I had to change a fair bit about how I was aiming easier to swallow. I wasn't starting over, I was just building in a new way from what I had already developed. As for how to know if you actually need to do that, that's the really hard part. Like I said, I don't think good technique is well defined right now. We're kind of in the early days of aim training as a space and aiming as a field. So the common advice is just to watch top players, and that is useful, that's good, but it always left me with the question of is my technique just different from those top players, or is my technique worse? Like I said, with static, there are multiple top players, they approach it in fundamentally different ways. They're both really good. What if I'm just doing that and I'm not good enough yet? My best attempt to define good technique is something like this. So good technique involves trying to make only the mouse movements you have to, while keeping the total number of distinct movements lower. So for example, perfect technique on tracking is tracking the very edge of the bot, which reduces the total amount of movement you need to make when the target strafes. And the second principle, which is reducing the total number of distinct individual mouse movements, comes into play on stuff like linear clicking, where if you were to flick past the target and wait for it to go under your crosshair, that's better than trying to flick a micro. Even though it's more total movement than you might have to make, it's more consistent since it's one single motion and there's less there's less potential links in that chain. There's less room for error, I guess. I don't think this is a perfect definition, and I'm sure you can find exceptions to both of these rules, but generally when evaluating my own technique, that's the framework I use. So am I making mouse movements I don't need to? What are they caused by? Are they caused by tension? Am I over flicking? And then how can I remove those excess movements? Or am I doing this in the fewest number of distinct movements possible? That kind of thing. The next question is from Ren, and it is, how important do you think mouse skates are, especially for glass pads? And I think not only having good mouse skates, but the right skates for your pad is insanely undervalued right now. People still say skates don't matter, they don't change anything. No, they really do, they really do, and especially on a glass pad. And To be completely honest, I can't use stock skates anymore on most mice because like aftermarkets have the potential to be so much better, and they're so cheap. You can get them for a couple dollars. For any glass pad, pretty much my favorite skates are the Ren Sports. They sound better than stock and are way smoother than like anything else I've tried. And for cloth, my favorite are, of course, the Artisan Dots, easily, but they aren't released yet. Once they do, I recommend those, but for now, the Ultra Glide Silence have my vote. And links to both will be in the description if you want to pick them up. I'm not affiliated with any of those companies. I just think all of the products are really good. So next one is, it's two actually. Does polling rate matter when it comes to aiming? If so, what polling rate do you use and why? From Victor. And does high polling rate offer a perceivable advantage? From Azura's Wrath, I think. Sorry if I butchered that. And I linked these in a one because they're basically the same thing. I have the same answer, which is that like, this is probably one of the least understood topics in the peripheral space at the moment, and one I'm not entirely certain of myself yet, but mostly for the aspects of like, how does this impact your aim? I'm working on a video at the moment which should help me get some semblance of an answer for that one. At least like a concrete answer. I do already have a guess that I think is accurate, but I'll get to that later. In the meantime, I do have info to add to the topic that isn't about performance that I think has been missed by people who have covered it before. So firstly, latency is not the most important factor of a higher polling rate. And yeah, one of the most common arguments I see against it is that like humans can't notice 0.5 ms lower latency, but that isn't what people are using higher polling rate for. The benefit is the consistency of inputs sent to your PC, and therefore the consistency of how mouse movements are represented on the screen. I'll link to a paper about this in the description. In my opinion, we can't draw much from it in terms of like conclusions for reasons I'll get into in the polling rate video. I have my issues with the study, but overall the information is like still pretty solid. The paper used the term temporal jitter for this potential visual deviation, which I'll use going forward. So I think the next part of this is a potential explanation I have for why some people, like myself included, swear that higher polling rate is significant visually, and others just like can't feel the difference at all. And there are two potential causes in my mind, and the first is that temporal jitter is like not exclusively tied to polling rate. So a lower polling rate could have more variation in cursor position than a higher polling rate if it interacts with the refresh rate in a certain way. So just as an example, 1000 Hz on a 144 Hz monitor has an expected jitter size of 0.1 milliseconds, whereas on a 240 Hz monitor, 2000 Hz polling rate has an expected jitter size of 0.25, which is like over double and puts it into the realm of being potentially noticeable, the variation that is, by a human. And this isn't just like tied to refresh rate increasing either. So like 500 Hz, for example, will have zero temporal jitter across all polling rates. 500 Hz monitors, that is. And the other factor here is that some people are just more sensitive to temporal jitter than other people. And I don't know what causes it, I don't know what causes someone to be more aware of it, but different people are more aware of inconsistencies than others. As for if it offers an advantage, everything I've seen so far is pretty inconclusive. I'm doing some testing on this myself, but I don't see me and me alone being able to 100% answer this. Personally, I have set my mouse to 4K, and I will lower it if I get frame drops, but if you aren't getting those frame drops, I don't see a reason not to at least have it set to, 2K, 4K. Next question is from Redar Bobe. How often do you think you should take a break from aim training? Can breaks be optimal for improving your aim, or are they a detriment? And I think they absolutely can help. I know some people like Matty never take breaks, but I've always found myself coming back feeling very mentally refreshed after a shorter one. It keeps my approach varied, and yeah, it helps me stay mentally sharp. I personally don't play every day these days, and I'll occasionally take weeks off if I'm particularly busy. And I do think the weeks off actually do hinder my progress a little, especially if I chain a couple together, then I'll come back and have a couple days where I'm like, okay, I've got to unwash now, what was I doing, what am I doing wrong? But, I think if it's just like a couple days, even a week, I don't really think it'll hinder your progress. And yeah, if you are feeling really stuck, a break can absolutely help. The next one is from Max Engie. Why do so many top aimers in CSGO or Valorant avoid glass mouse pads? Is there a reason you can think of, or do you think it's just a preference thing? And bonus question, do you think a glass pad aimer could become a pro? And I think it is a bit more than just preference. Glass pads and cloth pads are very fundamentally different, and because of that require fundamentally different techniques as well, which you have to relearn, and it makes it not worth swapping if you're a pro and you have to be constantly ready to perform well and play well in tournaments and scrims and prac, and you can't dedicate that mental energy and time to learning entirely new techniques for a glass pad. And there's the obvious element of speed. People like slower pads for tac shooters, but I do think the surface being solid has a larger impact than people realize. There are some aspects of glass pads that I think in theory could be good for some people in tac FPS games. For example, in cloth pads, it's very common to struggle with pressing down into the pad in a clutch situation or something, and it can create a lot of extra uncontrolled friction for you to fight against, which you really don't want in those moments. It can end with your pad feeling kind of muddy. Glass pads will prevent you from doing that, so that potential inconsistency is gone, but at the same time, that variable friction isn't always a bad thing. On cloth, if you're good enough to, you can lean into that slowdown to dynamically control that friction to get a faster or slower pad when you need it. And I think this is fairly common among tech FPS players too. It's why I started implementing it into my gameplay, and is also why I will never main a glass pad for an extended period of time. Having it be the same speed all the time is a negative for me. I know it's a big part of the sales pitch that it's perfectly consistent. I don't want that. There is a lot more to this discussion though. I think the idea people seem to have at the moment that glass equals more skillful, therefore it will make you better, is a little bit reductive, but I'll save that for a future video if people would like to, see that discussion. As for if someone could become a pro on glass, yeah, absolutely. There are already some incredibly good Valorant players who use skypads, for example. I talked to Bazin about this a bit ago, I forget their names, but yeah, really good, and they use the skypad for. But I just think for people who are already established in the game, and for most pros, it's not worth the time investment for, in my opinion, basically no reward in these games anyway. Shorter one, what would you recommend someone to do scenario-wise if they're over-flicking and under-flicking with micro-flicking and regular flicking from boredom? And I really like Pokeball scenarios for this. They're kind of static, but you don't need to click, and they really help me focus very specifically on having clean and smooth lines when going between each target, and I think they're really useful for wider flicks, micro stuff Six Sphere, Pokeball. They're just really good. Next question is from Jello Moon, and it is, if we're talking about shape is king, isn't that supposed to be comfort is king? You might say you aim better at this mouse than this mouse, but that doesn't define anything, it's more of a placebo. But when we're talking about comfort, it's noticeable as soon as you feel the mouse. Maybe there's more into it when finding your endgame mouse. What could be those things? And this one's tricky. There's a few things I want to talk about here. I don't really think it's placebo for comparing differences in performances between products. And for me, it's the starting point for a lot of my reviews. For example, I'm working on a video about the Ponage Trinity, and I kind of walk through that process in that review of okay, I'm playing bad. What's going on? Is it is there crazy DPI deviation? Is there more latency? Is it this? No. And then I did kind of figure out what was causing me to play bad, and I could isolate that variable, and this time I could physically remove it from the mouse and fix it. So I don't think trying different mice is entirely placebo when it comes to perceived difference in performance. And I don't think it's placebo for mouse pads either. They have a pretty drastic effect on my aiming style. So even if I play similarly skill-wise, I might aim very differently. And from there I can kind of work backwards, similar to what I do with mice, to figure out what properties of a certain pad are causing that change in style. Comfort on peripherals is an interesting topic though, since I used to think that the most comfortable mouse would be the best for aiming. I kind of agreed with what Jello was saying, and especially since a mouse that like causes you hand pains will prevent you from practicing long term and for long periods of time. But honestly, the more mice I try, the more I think you have to strike a balance between comfort and aiming potential. Like what kind of made it click for me was to think about what the purely, like when optimizing for purely comfort, what is the best shape? And the answer would probably be like a G502 adjacent, or like a vertical mouse or something. Just something that puts like no stress on your hands whatsoever. But mice like that prevent any kind of fingertip adjustments and just wouldn't work for aiming at a high level. You know, even if the G502 was like 50 grams, if you're palm gripping it, I don't know, you have no room for fingertip adjustments. I just don't think it would work. And kind of because of all that, I think that finding a shape that strikes a balance that works for you, both comfortable and flexible enough to aim well with, is like the biggest part of finding your perfect mouse. I agree there are other elements as well, like weight, sensor position, weight balance, build quality overall. I don't know. There's so much that like goes into this topic that it's hard to narrow out, it's hard to narrow down and single out a single thing like comfort. Thank you though, good question. It made me reflect on my thoughts on the topic. Next one. I recently started with aim training and have been on a glass pad for almost 2 months now, but I'm still so inconsistent with flicks and struggle with stress that messes up the aim. What can I do to improve this? Any tips to get really comfy on the glass pad? From Chris? And I don't have a very satisfactory answer for this one because glass pads are just harder for flicks generally. I don't think it's like a preference thing. I think they're pretty universally considered to be more challenging for flicking, especially if you're just starting out or you're coming from cloth. Like if you have like years of training on glass, maybe they'd be better for you, but I think most people will find them harder. And you know, I don't think I've ever been that good on glass relative to cloth. I usually play a lot worse. So I asked Pinguify for their thoughts on the topic. And the main thing that stood out to me from that conversation was just how different stopping technique is on cloth versus glass, sorry. Usually on cloth pads, people lean into the friction of it to slow their mouse down. You don't have to do anything to stop your mouse on a cloth pad. You can just kind of move the mouse and it will stop if you stop applying force to it. But on glass, that friction isn't like absent, but it's not strong enough to lean into in the same way. So you really have to turn to alternate stopping power techniques. And we talked about this in the voltaic video about flicking techniques, and all of that applies to glass tenfold in my opinion. So it is worth trying to apply some of the techniques we talked about in that video, and I think it really should help. Might also be worth looking into aftermarket skates as well. My favorites are the Ren Sports, like I said before, and they make glass feel way smoother, way more consistent, not much slower, but you know, I found they're way easier to aim on after swapping to Ren Sports. Next one is from Som TR, and it is, what mouse pads would you recommend for games like R6 where micro flicking is key? And I see Siege as being like, okay, full transparency first, I haven't played Siege in like 3-4 years, but I see it as being adjacent to games like Counter-Strike or Valorant when it comes to aiming styles. At least like looking at those three compared to like Apex or Overwatch, they all play pretty similarly. So I think a lot of what I said in my Artisan video about if a pad would work for Valorant or not would also apply to R6. So control pads offer benefits for stability on micro adjustments and flicks, and faster pads for fluidity and freedom of movement. And you can choose which one suits you best based on your playstyle. I still think the best mouse pads I've used are Artisan pads. It's why I'm talking about my Artisan video here, with the Time 99 being the best for control, Raiden for speed, and the Zero, or I guess Key 83 as well, for a like fairly neutral experience. Key 83 kind of leans towards speed though. They're all good. I recommend them all. There you go. Do you think if you're bored of certain scenarios that training them becomes pointless since you aren't engaged? From Ren. And I'm not really sure for this one. I do think game training is something that benefits a lot from conscious, focused practice rather than just like mindlessly playing scenarios or routines, but I don't think playing on autopilot makes it completely useless. I still found that playing a little a day to keep myself sharp worked while I was bored out of my mind doing it. And you don't need to play much of an aim trainer to feel those benefits in game. And personally, what I do these days is I like to put something on in the background while playing, like a long form video or podcast to keep my mind occupied. And even though I'm not like fully focused on the scenario, I'm not completely zoned out. And the next one, I have a long answer for this one, and please don't send hate towards these two. What are your thoughts on the shimmy technique? Do you think it has a lower skill ceiling than the Bardos technique? How applicable is it in games compared to the Bardos technique from Brandon Thomas? And I think both have their merits, and I do think shimmy and Bard both have very good technique in static scenarios, but I do think there is a bit more nuance to the topic than shimmy presented in his video. Specifically the bit about flicks though. Just to get my opinion up front, I don't think flicks are bad generally, like in games. I don't think they're bad on static either. And honestly, watching Shimmy's VODs, I don't think he thinks they're bad as well. The movement he does is probably what most people would consider to be a flick. He is still really fast, which kind of goes against the flick suck thing from his video. And so I think a better way to frame that flick suck idea is that uncontrolled flicks are bad specifically, and that going slower is better than flicking without control. But I don't think this idea of trying to remove flicks from our gameplay entirely is very helpful. Especially when targeted towards newer players. I think pushing speed is really important, and it's worth sacrificing a tiny bit of consistency to do so, as long as it's still controlled speed. I do have some minor critiques for Bardos's video as well though. I think there is some merit to trying to remove the delay between our flicks and micro adjustments, which is something that Bardos's method can actually make harder. Placing that emphasis entirely on the initial flick and making it as fast as possible really lends itself to this idea of having two very distinct movements. So flick, stop, micro. And when you flick as fast as you possibly can, you have to utilize a lot of tension, which can't instantly be released for that smooth micro adjustment. By slowing down mid-flick, it makes it easier to blend the two motions together, which you can see in someone like Xionlo's gameplay. And we will never see someone play like Xionlo who is flicking as fast as they possibly can. The two techniques are kind of fundamentally incompatible, and I do think there is a balance that can be struck. I think Shimmy covered this topic a lot better in his technique segment. Like I said, even though if I don't agree with everything in that video, his discussion of slowing down before the flick ends is very important to grasp and creates a much more fluid style than Bard's method can. I think both resources are good though, as long as you don't feel pressured to follow everything they say, to the letter. With shimmies, at least with how he talked about it in his video, could potentially create a lot of issues for in-game translation, since having fast initial flicks is a valuable skill and still worth practicing. And while I do think Shimmy's method would get you there eventually, taking the words in his video at face value, I think it'd get you there slower than what you'd want. Same goes for Bardos's video with the full sending flicks at max tension though, which is honestly something you almost never want to do and isn't what I feel like he does in his own static gameplay, so I don't know. I still don't really think anyone has entirely achieved perfect static technique, so it makes sense that the technique of any given player won't be completely optimal. And just for my thoughts, I think fast flicks are very important, and it's good to push yourself to go faster as long as you maintain control over that speed. Try to find a nice middle ground where you're still using a fair bit of tension, but not so much that you can't start to release it mid-flick for that smooth transition between a flick and a micro adjustment.